When you first met someone, did you form an opinion based on their work or looks? Little did you know that there was more to them than meets the eye. For a long time, the enormous corporation where Margaret Lawson worked paid little attention to the modest but diligent cleaning lady. Nobody gave her a second glance. But her wit and resolve would alter the course of events. For 15 years, Margaret had done the same routine, sweeping floors, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and making sure the offices were spotless before workers came. Without fail, she would arrive first thing in the morning and stay late into the night. Most of her co-workers didn't give her a second thought. They simply saw her as the cleaning lady. Like the furniture, she disappeared into the background, unnoticed by her co-workers. Her background, aspirations, and daily life went unquestioned. They passed by without batting an eye, maybe nodding if they were feeling really courteous. Not even the CEOs who she interacted with frequently paid her any attention. As they walked down the halls in their sharp suits, engrossed in business conversations and phone calls, they completely ignored the possibility that the woman mopping the floors had a deeper understanding of how the company operated than they had. However, Margaret was more than simply the lady with the mop. She has an indefatigable intellect and an exceptional attention to detail. Going about her work, she listened in on executive meetings late at night when they believed no one was there, taking notes on everything. Even if she was paying attention, they reasoned, she probably wouldn't get it. Discussions regarding company plans, budgets, and promotions were open and honest. They talked about the employees who were climbing the corporate ladder and those who were set to be fired. Their biggest mistake was failing to notice that Margaret was taking it all in. She gradually learned the ins and outs of the business, paying attention to minutiae that nobody else did. Though she did not hold any formal position related to the company's operations, her innate intelligence and years of careful observation enabled her to discern its advantages. As she worked, she had time to reflect. Working through her thoughts, she considered the choices being made up high. The decisions seemed to contradict the financial data. Why was that? Even though the business was allegedly doing well, why were certain workers let go? She had an opinion even if no one ever sought it out, and if they had listened attentively, they would have known that Margaret knew considerably more than they had imagined. Regarding her employment, she had no resentment. She was proud of her employment because it allowed her to provide for her family. However, she couldn't turn a blind eye to the way others treated her. Since she was only seen around town in her uniform and with her mop, most people thought she couldn't possibly be competent. They had no idea that Margaret had worked in the corporate sector herself in her younger years. In her previous career, she had been a financial analyst whose duties had included researching markets, compiling reports, and advising clients on financial matters. Unfortunately, life had suddenly become very harsh. A tragic event in her family's life had compelled her to leave her job. At the time, cleaning was her only option for a stable income, which she desperately needed to provide for her family. Although it wasn't her ideal situation, she accepted it without grumbling since she knew that supporting her family was more critical than feeling good about herself. Following her departure from the corporate sector, Margaret continued her thirst for knowledge. In her leisure time, she studied industry reports, stayed abreast of financial news, and continued honing the abilities she had used every day. She was well versed in the ins and outs of a company's financial system, including how its reports should reflect its true performance and how seemingly little differences may be signs of more serious problems. That's why her gut told her something was wrong when she saw discrepancies in the company's financial records, such as papers that were carelessly left on desks and figures that didn't add up. She originally assumed it was just a typo. However, her realization of a negative trend became increasingly apparent as she continued to examine the situation. As far as Margaret was concerned, she had no business speaking up. Nobody would give her any serious thought because she was only the cleaning lady. But one thing became crystal clear to her as she persisted in her work, listening and watching. Something was seriously amiss at the company, and nobody else appeared to notice. Once upon a time, Margaret Lawson was a rising star in the financial world. She would analyze markets and make important business decisions. Unfortunately, she had to give up her promising profession due to a terrible family tragedy. Life isn't always fair. Stability, in the form of regular hours and an immediate salary, was what she needed. Cleaning was the sole offered job option. Margaret felt proud of her work, even though it wasn't the future she had imagined for herself. She maintained the same keen, analytical mind that had propelled her to success, even though her career path had taken a surprising turn. Her data analysis skills, including her capacity to recognize trends and anomalies, were unaffected. She maintained her ties to the financial world while spending her days washing floors and emptying garbage cans. Under the radar, she read publications, tracked market movements, and kept her expertise current. Knowledge was power, she came to understand with time, something that most people fail to notice. Even though she had stepped down from her position of power, her commercial acumen remained. It was for this reason that her intuition took over when she overheard workers discussing confidential account details. Unattended reports on desks, charts in boardrooms, and whispered chats in hallways caught her attention. Initially, she was perplexed, but her unease grew as she closely observed. A pattern started to emerge, and it severely concerned her, because the figures she saw didn't add up. Margaret was well aware that she was unable to utter a word. Who would pay attention to a maid? Nobody even thought she would be able to read and comprehend complicated financial reports, much less challenge them. However, as she continued to observe, it became increasingly apparent that something was amiss with the way the organization was running. She kept finding discrepancies. There was no spying on her part. Everything she observed was plainly visible to her. No one batted an eye when someone they hardly noticed discussed financial plans or left sensitive documents out in the open. Margaret took it all in, whether it was a misplaced spreadsheet or a whispered discussion about unforeseen financial deficits. Secretly exposing the company's inner workings, the woman cleaning the executives' offices was never an idea of the executives. They saw her as nothing more than an ordinary employee carrying out her duties. However, the truth was that Margaret was the only one who could see the impending doom. That is, trouble. Thomas Reed, who was both the creator and CEO of the corporation, was at the very top of everything, an authoritative figure who demanded respect regardless of its merit. He thought he was the only one who could appreciate the company's worth as he had created it from scratch. Strict, cold, and merciless best described his leadership style. Though it came at a cost, the corporation flourished under his leadership. Beyond his commercial acumen, Thomas exhibited a pathological preoccupation with authority. He had zero tolerance for error and insisted on flawlessness. Everyone on staff was terrified of him, and rightfully so. He would dismiss employees without hesitation after publicly shaming them if they failed to meet his standards. People could be assets or liabilities in Thomas's view, and everyone who proved to be an unnecessary burden was promptly removed. The higher-ups imitated his icy, ruthless attitude by following his lead. Everyone from upper management on down to Margaret was treated with the same callous disregard. She was mere scenery to Thomas. He didn't even consider her a person, an anonymous employee who maintained a clean workplace. With the exception of passing glances, he never spoke to her or even acknowledged that she existed. He didn't think she was worthy of his time. As Margaret meticulously buffed the lobby's marble flooring one morning, Thomas bounded through the building en route to a crucial meeting. A piercing echo resounded from his pricey leather shoes on the spotless floor. He smirked as he swung by her, glancing down briefly. Neither a greeting nor an expression of gratitude was it. As if to emphasize the immense disparity between their realities, it was a brief period of dominance. Before he had reached the next corridor, he had already forgotten about her and went away without saying a word. However, there were more instances like this. It was commonly known that Thomas had a condescending attitude toward lower-level staff. Outside of the executive offices, he saw the cleaning crew, receptionists, and everyone else as interchangeable components of the machine he had constructed. He shouldn't have wasted his time on them. Growing the business, maximizing earnings, and consolidating his control remained his top priorities. One night at the business gala, a few of the lower-level executives hung out at the bar, drinking champagne and talking about office rumors. With live jazz music and famous faces in attendance, the occasion was lavish. The name Margaret rose amidst the noise and mirth. They made a joke about how she had been here for a long time, probably doesn't aspire to be anything other than the housekeeper. Amused by the concept, the others chuckled. She was merely an object to them, someone whose sole purpose was to clear their mess. Overhearing the discussion was Thomas, who had been hosting a group of investors in the area. With a mischievous grin on his face, he shared a quiet laugh. He found the thought that Margaret might be anything other than what she was to be ridiculous. In the end, she was only an assistant. He completely disregarded the matter. The woman they were so quick to fire would eventually become the cause of the most significant disruption in the organization, but neither he nor anyone else involved anticipated this. Thomas's haughtiness extended beyond the lower-level staff as well. He was a firm leader who would not budge from his firm's position and would not take advice or criticism. Everyone on his board and in his executive suite had learned long ago not to question his judgment. Anyone who ventured to challenge him was swiftly put in their proper place. His word was final. His business, the empire he had created, was beginning to crumble, but Thomas failed to notice and would not admit it. The behind-the-scenes financial mismanagement was becoming more than just a minor error. He was too preoccupied with preserving his reputation to see that the ground upon which his achievements rested was starting to disintegrate. At the same time, while no one else was looking, the cleaning lady Margaret, whom he had disregarded for years, was stealthily collecting the parts of the puzzle. She noticed the carelessness with money, the poor choices, and the blunders. Something was seriously wrong, she realized when she heard anxious murmurs in the corridors and caught a peek of the mismatched numbers. Despite Thomas's amusement at the thought of Margaret being anything other than a housekeeper, she was actually hiding a secret that would destroy his entire enterprise. At the business gala, Thomas overheard the talk and grinned. The idea that Margaret would never be able to leave her position made one of the junior executives chuckle and say, "She's been here forever, probably doesn't even dream of being anything more than the cleaning lady." The rest of the executives joined in on the laughter, amused by this revelation. They didn't think much of her beyond her role as an indestructible floor scrubber for the duration of her life. Thomas, taken aback, couldn't help but giggle, along with a little dismissive laugh of his own. It was absurd to think that someone of Margaret's caliber could surpass her status. In the end, she was only an assistant. He completely disregarded the matter. He had no idea that the woman he was making fun of would shortly be in the epicenter of the most seismic shift in the company's history. Thomas's haughtiness went much beyond his callousness toward lower-level staff. He was so sure that he was right all the time that he exercised absolute control over the business. Suggestions were taken very seriously by him, and he surely would not abide criticism. No one on the board or in the executive suite dared to question him. What he said was final. His power was so absolute that anyone who ventured to challenge it soon found themselves unemployed. Thomas had made many enemies over the years due to his inflexible leadership style, but it didn't bother him. He thought he was impenetrable. Everything was secondary as long as money was coming in. The gradual collapse of the business he had founded, however, eluded his notice. Hidden financial mismanagement by the very executives he trusted was beginning to cause fractures to grow beneath the surface, and everything was on the brink of collapse. Over time, Thomas's confidence transformed into complacency despite his former brilliance. He fooled himself into thinking he was an expert on his company when in reality he had cut himself off from its day-to-day running. Truthfully, he was clueless about what was going on. He failed to notice the red flags despite their obvious presence. Plus, he had no idea Margaret's degree of knowledge or experience because he fired lower-level employees like her. Under Thomas's narcissistic belief in his own invincibility, Margaret was secretly solving a mystery that not even he could solve. She observed what others failed to notice while going about her everyday tasks. Nobody else would dare admit the financial blunders, careless spending, or risky decisions that she saw. She spotted papers strewn carelessly on desks and overheard discussions that weren't meant for her to hear. Margaret had an innate grasp of the business that didn't necessitate affirmation from individuals like Thomas. Everything she needed was at her fingertips. The fate of the corporation would shortly be decided by her knowledge, not Thomas's. Instead of taking responsibility for their actions, Margaret saw executives cover up their terrible decisions. Meetings were fraught with apprehensive stares and whispers about lost money and upcoming layoffs, which she overheard. Even while Thomas scowled at her and ignored her, she was secretly collecting evidence that would bring him down. Everyone paid close attention to Thomas in the boardroom. His voice was commanding and his demeanor was menacing. He took pride in the fact that the company had flourished under his guidance, and he had a point. His haughtiness, nevertheless, had prevented him from seeing reality. He was preoccupied with preserving his power image that he failed to detect the internal collapse of the empire he had constructed. Even a cleaning lady didn't seem like a threat to Thomas because she was underneath him. But as time passed, Margaret learned more and more about the dire circumstances in which the business was operating. Acknowledgement and approval were unnecessary for her. Receiving compliments wasn't her goal. She was just a person who could perceive reality and take appropriate action. Margaret secretly possessed the company's future, while Thomas and his executives gleefully exhibited their dominance. Her insights, observations, and knowledge of the situation will soon be revealed. Everything would shift once it happened. No one could have foreseen the depth of Margaret Lawson's education and expertise, given that she was merely a cleaning lady to everyone else. Her life took a sudden turn when she was working as a financial analyst for a tiny but rapidly expanding company. She was well versed in the stock market, had reviewed financial records, and offered investment advice. She also excelled in it. Because of her keen intellect, she had a natural talent for solving difficult financial riddles and seeing patterns that others missed. However, it caught her off guard, as life frequently does. Margaret had to abandon the career she had fought so hard for due to a personal tragedy. She got a cleaning job because it was the first thing that was available when she needed a reliable income to feed her family. Despite the fact that it wasn't her ideal, she accepted it without grumbling. She wasn't scared of putting in long hours because she had people to feed and bills to pay. The analytical side of her intellect, meanwhile, never stopped working. Margaret would spend her free time reading market reports, subscribing to financial newsletters, and keeping tabs on trends in the business sector. Her focus was unwavering even as she wiped down surfaces and filled garbage cans. She was numerate, knew how money moved, and could interpret the figures that determined a business's fortunes. A new chapter had opened up in her life, but her wisdom had not vanished. Cleaning up after people who neglected her in the corporate offices made her pay attention to details that others had missed. Spread out on desks and bulletin boards were financial reports and spreadsheets, documents containing information that the average person would check at once and then forget. That executives and employees had left behind. However, Margaret, distinct patterns were visible to her. It all made sense to her. What she found out was shocking, because no one else had ventured to look. The papers that Margaret found strewn across desks and affixed to bulletin boards were materials that the majority of employees considered to be ordinary. They thought no one outside of their group would get how important they were. Margaret, though, saw more than simply bits of paper. She saw clues, and she had a perfect grasp on their meaning. Margaret found a quarterly financial report lying around the junior executive's office one day as she was dusting. She detected anything out of the ordinary with only a cursory glance. Contrary to what she had observed earlier on another workstation, the revenue statistics did not match the spending forecasts. The more she looked, the more her curiosity piqued. The figures were entirely wrong. They weren't merely contradictory. It might have seemed like an innocent mistake to someone who isn't well-versed in financial matters. However, Margaret's discriminating eyes saw otherwise. There was no error here. A warning sign appeared. She kept finding the same inconsistencies throughout the following weeks. There was inconsistency across divisions' reports, and some of the company's numbers seemed artificially high. In instance, there was a document that stuck out, a series of quarterly financial predictions that were excessively optimistic considering the company's present financial situation. It had been left in full sight on the chief financial officer's desk. In her prior profession, Margaret had spent sufficient time examining figures to discern the situation. This went beyond careless accounting. Mismanagement of funds was considerably worse. While working her shifts, her thoughts raced as she tried to put together the pieces of the puzzle. Nobody else appeared to notice the story that the data were saying. Not only was bad decision-making a factor, but the corporation was also going towards major difficulty. Some thought has gone into the distribution of monies. Costs were increasing at a rate the business couldn't keep up with, and the numbers didn't add up. The company was heading straight into bankruptcy if this trend persisted. Margaret was aware that she couldn't simply deliver her findings to an executive's office no matter how much evidence she had. Everyone would doubt her. She was simply seen as the housekeeper by them. Nobody at the company had ever even contemplated the idea that she might have any idea what she was doing when it came to the intricate world of corporate finance. Even though she knew she could prevent the company's collapse, she refused to sit on her hands and let it happen. Margaret, intent on discovering the whole scope of the issue, started meticulously documenting everything. She meticulously recorded any inconsistencies she discovered in reports, compared statistics from several departments, and recorded any concerning patterns that continued to surface. With time, more details became apparent. There was more than one issue with the financial mismanagement. There was a systemic problem. This mess was the result of a cascade of poor choices, including throwing money at pointless initiatives, not recording losses, and inflating profits. Her worries only grew as the weeks went by. The executives were either unaware of the situation or, even worse, were trying to hide it. Although she had not yet identified which, she did know that the company's finances were rapidly deteriorating. The powerful wouldn't be the only ones impacted when it occurred. The company's hundreds of employees would take the brunt of the consequences because they relied on it for their lives. As Margaret completed her rounds one evening, she sat silently in the break room, her gaze fixed on her notes. What she had found was a heavy burden for her to bear. Nobody else appeared to notice that the company was a ticking time bomb. There was no hiding the reality from her. She possessed the information, the proof, and the ability. What would be her next move was the last remaining question. As her thoughts raced with all the new information, Margaret sat silently in the break room. Even though the firm's finances were precariously balanced, nobody appeared to notice the impending disaster. She pondered the duration until the facts emerged, when the figures caught up with the fabrications and the whole thing crumbled. Even though she was well equipped to address the issue, she was confined to a position where her expertise was undervalued. But Margaret was never one to give up without a fight. She had learned resilience from her experiences, the ability to persevere in the face of adversity. She was in no way powerless simply because she was perceived as the help by others. There was a silver lining to the terrible situation. No one was keeping tabs on her. She was taken aback because the executives and staff had long disregarded her. Margaret came to the realization that her decisions would determine the company's destiny and, by extension, her own future. After she had learned all this, what would she do? Would she blend in, unnoticed, like any other housekeeper? Instead, would she put herself in danger by coming out and telling the truth? We were entering the end game when it came to picking up after other people. Margaret now had a much larger mess, a potential financial catastrophe to clear up. With a newfound determination, she persisted in her usual unassuming manner as she made her way through the organization. She was listening, watching, and gathering evidence, not merely sweeping floors or emptying garbage cans. Every word spoken or document left out in the open that she happened to overhear added another clue. She had detected recurring problems with the financial reports anomaly. They were an aspect of a more fundamental, systemic problem. No one was prepared to confront the fact that employees were hiding losses, manipulating data, and participating in dangerous trades. The business continued to head straight into bankruptcy throughout this time. Everything that Margaret could find, from inconsistencies in financial records to discussions she overheard that were fishy to dealings that seemed sketchy behind closed doors, she meticulously documented. The gravity of her discovery was not lost on her. Poor leadership wasn't the only factor. It was a calculated lie, a cover-up with the potential to bring the entire corporation crashing down. Margaret, though, was not innocent. No amount of storming into an executive's office was going to get her the truth. She knew it. Her seriousness would be misunderstood. They could even dismiss her immediately if they accused her of eavesdropping. Therefore, she kept mum, assuming the persona of the unseen housekeeper while stealthily constructing a case. As Margaret went about her daily routine, she paid great attention to the people around her. While the maid wiped tables and emptied trash, executives chatted loudly in the corridors. They spoke on the company's public image, future financial reports, and business strategy. Margaret could discern beneath their self-assured statements the uneasiness they wished to bury. Something wasn't right, and they were aware of it. They failed to grasp the gravity of the situation. For some reason, Margaret listened intently to one discussion in particular. While cleaning up the area around the executive boardroom late at night, Margaret's focus became laser-like. While engrossed in their chat, two senior managers strolled past. While preparing for the quarterly earnings report, they spoke in a low, anxious tone. They would have to change the report so it looked like the company was doing better than it actually was, one of them said, because the figures didn't look good. Her ears perked up, Margaret. That meant they were plotting to hide the losses, and she knew it by heart. Margaret felt her thoughts racing as the men continued on their journey, oblivious to her presence. This proved her worst suspicions about the company's cover-up of its financial problems. In order to give investors and the public a misleading impression, the executives were purposefully distorting the figures. Now, this was outright fraud, not only mismanagement. Hundreds of workers would lose their jobs when the company collapsed if they persisted down this road. Worse yet, Margaret understood that the company's leadership may be subject to legal ramifications in the event that the truth were to emerge. Margaret increased her vigilance throughout the following weeks toward the company's inner workings. It was her observation that certain workers were staying late, always engaged in clandestine meetings, or frantically trying to hide their activities. Spending was relegated to inaccessible sections of the budget, and last-minute changes were being made to financial reports. While she was there, she overheard executives talking about unrecorded deals, unofficial partnerships, and inflated profits. It became more apparent the more she dug, this wasn't just a troubled business. A corporation that was about to collapse was in that state. The CEO, Thomas Reed, continued to be oblivious to the mayhem unfolding right beneath his nose. He persisted in managing the business as though nothing was wrong, his haughtiness preventing him from seeing the red flags. Ignoring the fact that his empire was founded on deceit, he spoke grandly about expansion plans and future investments. Nobody dared to tell him the truth because his faith in his leadership was unwavering. Never doubted Thomas. He wasn't that type of guy. As he sashayed around the office smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with investors and inspiring his team, Margaret stood back and watched him every day. It was astonishing how unaware he was. How could someone with his level of intelligence and achievement miss the obvious? In the end, Margaret felt conflicted. It was tempting for her to just let everything fall apart. Their haughtiness, lack of appreciation for the company's backbone employees, and unwavering confidence in their own abilities made it look like they were doomed to fail. It could have been justified. Margaret, though, wasn't merely a bystander. The stakes were clear to her. The execs wouldn't be the only ones to lose out if the company went under. Hundreds of workers would be let off despite their lack of involvement in the financial cover-ups. It would be difficult for families. Outside of the boardroom, the consequences would be far-reaching. Margaret was still burdened with a heavy feeling of duty. It seems terrible to disregard her expertise and knowledge, when she could have helped. As time went on, her inner turmoil intensified. The truth could be exposed, but she knew it could put her in danger. Executives didn't have any grounds to believe her or trust her. Her every action could have disastrous consequences if she erred. Simultaneously, though, being silent was absolutely out of the question. The impending demise of the corporation was now a real and present danger. Preventative measures needed to be taken by someone. Margaret kept on collecting data as the weeks went by. Patterns, figures, and details abound in her notebook. She was doing more than just gathering bits and pieces of data. She was building a narrative. All the inconsistencies she noticed, the whispers she overheard, and the documents someone had carelessly left on a desk were pointing her in the direction of one inevitable conclusion. It wasn't only that the corporation was in jeopardy. Margaret was the only one who could perceive the depth of the corruption. Now that Margaret had gathered some evidence, she could start to create a case. She got a better picture of the company's financial catastrophe with each note she took. The image got more distinct as she linked additional dots. The executives weren't merely engaging in dubious dealings, they were perpetrating massive fraud, hiding their losses from investors and carelessly risking the company's future. Still, Margaret showed no signs of terror even in the face of the seriousness of her discovery. She was instead filled with an increasing feeling of direction. She had been a spectator to the expansion of this business for 15 years, and now she knew more than anybody else about what was going on behind the scenes. Margaret still held the fate of the company in her hands, but the employees mocked and ignored her, treating her like a maid. Either she could do nothing and let the world crumble around her, or she could take charge, apply her expertise, and attempt to rescue the corporation from its own demise. On that fateful evening, Margaret stalked James Holloway's office in silence, her anxiety mounting. For some reason, the CFO had always given off an air of cold calculation, but she could never put her finger on why. Now that she was standing in front of his desk, she saw a binder that seemed to be tempting her to peek inside, as if left open carelessly. She quickly glanced around the room to confirm she was alone herself. Prior to this time, nobody would have questioned the cleaning lady's presence. She had never cleaned up a disaster on a grander scale than the one she was about to reveal. As soon as Margaret's eyes landed on the page in front of her, a knot began to develop in her gut. The figures were damning as much as they were ugly. Expenses were unwarranted. Secret accounts were receiving large quantities of money. The worst part was that James had been hiding the company's financial woes by taking money. She hadn't anticipated how bad it would be. James was making every effort to conceal the fact that the company was not only in turmoil, but it was on the verge of bankruptcy. A catastrophe would ensue if word of this got out. A large number of workers would be let go. There would be no pensions left. That would shatter lives. As Margaret's thoughts raced through the consequences, her heart rate increased. Now it was about more than just questionable business dealings. This affected the livelihoods of the individuals she encountered on a daily basis. The janitors, receptionists, and other diligent workers whose prospects were precariously predicated. Something has to be done, she knew. The question is, how? In the view of the executive, she was just a cleaning girl. How could she bring down the CFO and reveal a cover-up of this magnitude? Margaret made up her mind the following morning. The silence became unbearable for her. She had to exercise caution, though. Dealing with James head-on could be risky. Equally perilous looked to be approaching CEO Thomas Reed. His haughtiness prevented him from seeing the chaos around him, and he refused to listen to someone as humble as her. One thing Margaret had going for her that nobody else did was her ability to disappear into the background. She had spent a great deal of time studying the business, its habits, and its shortcomings. She was masterful at getting her point across without attracting undue notice. She put her strategy into action that afternoon. Margaret gambled with her life. She painstakingly detailed all she had found regarding the financial irregularities within the organization in an anonymous letter that she typed up. She was careful not to spill the beans all at once, as her reputation was riding on the reaction to the news. It could backfire if you bombard Thomas with too many details. Instead, she had to grab his interest just enough to get him to pay more attention to the thing that was unfolding before his very eyes. Margaret pointed out the most serious warning signs in her letter, including strange activity at James's bank accounts, blatant discrepancies in financial records, and the impending bankruptcy that nobody else appeared to notice. Without disclosing her identity, she wrote precisely, making sure every point was understood. Her identity couldn't be revealed at this time for fear of danger. Her job and potentially her safety would be jeopardized if James or any of the other executives discovered who was behind the letter. Margaret meticulously inserted the printed letter inside an envelope. Before heading to Thomas's office, she waited until it was nearly empty. She had a good idea of where he stashed his most essential documents, among all the reports and papers on his desk, the same spot he examined first thing in the morning. With a long inhalation, Margaret plopped the envelope atop his pile of reports, making sure it would be the focal point of his arrival the following day. She was worried sick as she walked out of the office that night. Imagine if Thomas didn't get a letter. Even if he did, how seriously would he approach it? No one could have foreseen his response. She had no idea if he would think it was stupid or, worse, an attempt to make her question her authority. But Margaret secretly wished that her words, spoken from the heart, would be enough to shatter his haughtiness. She had fulfilled her role. Thomas was now left with the rest. The next morning, Margaret proceeded as usual, cleaning the offices and ensuring that everything was in its proper place. However, she was preoccupied with what might be going on in the office of the CEO right then and there. Had Thomas even opened the letter? The situation at his company was much worse than he had anticipated. Was he now beginning to see the bigger picture? On the other hand, was he so sure of his leadership that he disregarded the possibility that something so terrible was transpiring while he was in charge? Margaret was determined not to come across as anxious or suspicious, so she kept her composed manner and disappeared into the background like she usually did. She kept asking herself, did my anonymous warning make a difference as the hours ticked by? While cleaning up the area around the executive offices later that afternoon, Margaret overheard something encouraging. Undertones of secrecy could be heard as Thomas's assistant spoke on the phone. As she mumbled, "He's furious," she said. "The financials have revealed something. An urgent board meeting has been convened by him." A little beat skipped Margaret's heart. It had been successful. After seeing the warning, Thomas took immediate action. It was just the start, but she had faith that the truth will emerge when Thomas began to investigate. Skimming money and covering up the company's shortcomings were things James would soon have to do without. Margaret resisted the need to relax just yet. Even though everything were moving, she could still feel the distance ahead. The CEOs were influential and determined to resist. However, Margaret had made every effort to raise the alarm. She had to keep her wits about her, keep the company from collapsing before the truth was out, and keep an eye on things. Tension pervaded the workplace in the days that ensued. Margaret maintained a low profile as she listened, watched, and silently readied herself for what might come next. She had unleashed an irreversible chain reaction, and the true struggle was just around the corner. Both her own future and the company's continued existence were precariously balanced. Sitting in his office, Thomas Reed stared blankly at the wall as the crumpled letter remained on his desk. He had ignored the anonymous warning for 4 days, thinking it was just an angry employee trying to cause trouble or an unfounded rumor. Nobody dared to challenge his leadership. He was the one who started the business and worked his way up. He had transformed it into a formidable financial force. However, he was more troubled than he wanted to acknowledge by the tone of the letter. But Thomas still wasn't the sort to respond to baseless allegations. Instead of trusting rumors, he put his faith in cold, objective evidence. Little data, albeit concerning, began to line up with the letter's assertions as time went on. Reports that needed to be finalized never were. Things started to appear fishy with numbers that had balanced out before. He dismissed it as mere coincidence at first. However, the persistent uncertainty persisted. Years of overseeing the company had refined his senses, and no matter how much he tried to ignore them, something was amiss. After much hesitation, Thomas finally issued an order for an internal probe. Even his closest advisors were in the dark about what had caused it. He preferred to find out about problems in his own way, without letting anyone in on his plans. The upper management was taken aback by the move. Ever since he became emperor, Thomas had been incredibly sure, maybe even arrogant, about the security of his realm. His once greatest strength, certainty, now felt like a double-edged sword as he sat alone in his office. The initial weaknesses became apparent shortly after the internal auditors got to work. The first results were concerning. They revealed financial discrepancies that went back years. However, Thomas's worst fears were realized as they continued to dig. The budget's hidden losses had been meticulously stashed away in inconvenient places. Inflated profits were used to appease investors. James Holloway was the hub of it all. Before everybody else, Margaret had known the truth. At last, Thomas was getting a glimpse of it. Still, he couldn't shake the fundamental question: who had written the letter? Who had the audacity to forewarn him of the impending peril long before he did? The individual who had averted catastrophe for Thomas's business was not a powerful investor, board member, or executive. Though he was unaware of this at the moment, the maid who had gone unrecognized for 15 years was the one individual he had never even thought about. Far more than Thomas was willing to acknowledge, but he still wasn't the sort to respond to false allegations made by complete strangers. Instead of trusting rumors, he put his faith in cold, objective evidence. But as time went on, he started to notice little but concerning details that corroborated the letter's assertions. Reports that were supposed to be approved were not. It appeared as though some numbers were no longer balanced. At first he disregarded it, thinking it was just a coincidence. Still, the gnawing doubt intensified with each passing day. He made an effort to disregard it, but his gut feeling, developed over years of managing the business, informed him that something was off. Despite its anonymity, the message was too detailed to ignore. With some reluctance, Thomas directed an internal probe. No one, not even his closest advisors, knew what had caused it. If there were issues, he preferred to find out about them privately without informing anyone. The decision rocked the upper management to their core. The security of Thomas's empire had always given him confidence, maybe even an unhealthy dose of it. Confidence, which had been his strongest suit before, now seemed like a weakness in the quiet of his office. The initial vulnerabilities were exposed quickly as a result of the internal auditor's rapid action. Unsettling results emerged first. The financial reports were inconsistent and went back a few years. After delving more, it became clear that the corporation was exposed to enormous financial risk due to the poorly constructed nature of some of its largest acquisitions. While profits were fraudulently inflated to appease investors, hidden losses were tucked away in inconspicuous sections of the budget. However, CFO James Holloway was directly implicated in the most devastating revelation. James had been stealing from the company for a long time, it was discovered. Using intricate accounting maneuvers, he had hidden the fact that he had transferred money into personal accounts. Even worse, he had deceived both shareholders and employees with his deceptive tactics that affected the company's performance. The corporation was in a precarious position. It was about to go under. Finally, James's hidden mound of debt and financial incompetence was about to crumble. The situation infuriated Thomas. Despite his quick summons of James, the battle that ensued was far from satisfactory. James attempted to shift the blame by saying there had been a misunderstanding. However, the proof was incontestable. Thomas, utterly rattled, could do nothing except immediately dismiss James. Thomas felt a mixture of wrath and shame as he watched James leave the building for good. How could he, who took great satisfaction in his commanding presence, have failed to see all of this? Secret after secret of dishonesty was uncovered as the investigation progressed. Thomas was taken aback. His unwavering self-assurance had crumbled. He had always considered himself a formidable leader, capable of preventing crises from escalating. He was completely unprepared for this, though. His life's work, the corporation, was on the brink of collapse. Even then, he hadn't known the truth until an anonymous letter had told him. The entire gravity of the situation became clear to Thomas as he perused the final report. James had been stealing from the company and had also put the entire organization at risk with his unscrupulous financial practices. The corporation might face criminal penalties, a precipitous drop in stock price, and the exodus of investors if the truth were to get out. This was an impending catastrophe, not merely a scandal. So, what's the worst? Ignoring that letter would have led Thomas blindly into disaster. Thomas knew it. The identity of the letter's sender, however, continued to trouble him. She was engaged in. Keeping her voice firm, Margaret thanked Mr. Thomas for agreeing to meet with her. As she took a seat, she set a little folder on his desk, which she had been holding. Unable to make sense of what was happening, Thomas leaned forward. "What can I do for you, Margaret?" he inquired, maintaining a neutral tone despite the obvious bewilderment in his eyes. Although he had seen her presence in the building for quite some time, he had never once thought that she could possibly have some insight into the company's operations. Quickly, Margaret made her move. Thomas saw the importance of the financial records, transaction history, and meticulous notes that she had meticulously prepared as soon as she opened the folder. As he turned the pages, his eyes widened in surprise. The auditors had also found these inconsistencies, but Margaret's notes were even more detailed and exacting. Margaret declared, "I've been watching for a long time," as she studied Thomas's posture with great attention. "At first, I thought the inconsistencies were just mistakes, but the more I saw, the more I realized they weren't. The patterns kept repeating." As his thoughts raced, Thomas's hands remained motionless on the pages. "Were you aware of this?" he whispered quietly. "Yes," Margaret agreed. "For months now. I used to work as a financial analyst before I took this job. Circumstances changed, but my ability to read numbers didn't. I saw the red flags in your reports, the ones left lying around on desks. I didn't want to jump to conclusions without solid evidence, so I started taking notes, collecting everything I could, and when I realized how serious it was, I sent you that anonymous letter." Leaning back on his seat, Thomas was taken aback into quietness. Margaret, the cleaning lady he had hardly acknowledged for years, had written the anonymous letter that had set things in motion. The power dynamics changed in ways he hadn't expected, and the room seemed to tip. Being with someone so different from his usual circle of business aristocrats made him feel exposed for the first time in his professional life. With a composed demeanor, Margaret proceeded. "I didn't come here to threaten you or demand anything, Mr. Thomas, but I believe we can help each other. You're in a difficult position, and I have information that can assist you in stabilizing the company before things get worse." His thoughts were racing. The situation's irony was nearly unbearable. For years, he ignored the one who ended up saving his company. With an unintentionally harsh tone, he demanded, "What do you want?" A little knowing smile escaped Margaret's lips. "I'm not asking for much. I want an opportunity. I know this company better than anyone realizes, and I've proven that I have the skills to contribute in ways no one expected. All I'm asking for is a chance to use those skills in a role that reflects my abilities, not just my job title." She was under Thomas's scrutiny. Sitting before him was a woman he hadn't recognized. Not only was she more than simply the housekeeper, she had the brains, vision, and guts to expose a scandal that may have ruined his fortune. While scratching his temples, he let out a slow breath. He continued to try to make sense of everything and inquired, "You want a position in the company afterwards?" "Yes," Margaret agreed. "I never expected anything from this company other than a paycheck, but I can't stand by and watch it fall apart when I know I can help. I've already proven that I understand the numbers, the risks. Give me a chance, and I'll help you rebuild." His thoughts were racing. His faith in his management and the stability of his organization had already been eroded. Margaret was correct, though. Over the years, she had shown herself to be more competent than other individuals he had placed his trust in. Thomas spoke after a considerable interval. With a heavy heart, he sighed and let out a slow breath as he realized the gravity of the situation. If what you're saying is true and you've already helped save this company from the brink, then maybe it's time I started seeing people for who they really are, not just what position they hold. Margaret, if you're willing to work with me, I'll make sure you get the chance you're asking for. A small smile spread across Margaret's face. Since sending the letter, she had anticipated this moment would arrive. She now had control over what happened next. Standing up, Thomas reached out a hand. The power dynamic changed once more when Margaret accepted it. However, on this occasion, there was mutual regard. He finally realized that the woman he had ignored for so long was the key to save his business and, by extension, his reputation. Nothing would ever be the same again, Margaret realized as she walked out of the office that fateful night. Once disregarded, the cleaning lady was now pivotal to the turnaround of the business. Even if the path ahead was unclear, she was eager to take it. Thomas looked straight at Margaret as he gently let out a breath. He had fooled himself into thinking he could run his business solo for years, but now he was being approached by someone he had hardly paid attention to previously. The level of irony was nearly intolerable. In contrast to his trusted executives, she had discovered the truth. And now she was pleading for an opportunity, a position where she could make a difference beyond just mopping floors. While attempting to take it all in, he massaged his temples. With a lowered voice, Thomas said, "Maybe it's time I started looking at people for who they really are, not just the positions they hold. If what you're saying is accurate and you've already helped save this organization from the verge." With her composure, Margaret watched him intently. Even though she was aware that this was a trying time for him, she felt confident in her request because she had worked hard for it. "Margaret," Thomas said, his posture becoming more upright, "if you're prepared to collaborate with me, I will ensure that you receive the opportunity you have requested." On Margaret's face, a subtle grin spread. From the minute she submitted the letter, she knew this moment would arrive. She had taken control of her destiny. Standing up, Thomas reached out a hand. Margaret eagerly accepted it. A new power dynamic had emerged, one predicated on mutual regard rather than aggression. He now considered the woman he had fired a key player in the future of the organization. That evening, as Margaret stepped out of his office, she felt a renewed feeling of purpose that had eluded her for years. For a long time, she had stayed out of sight, but now she was taking the lead. She had transformed from a housekeeper into a force that could alter the company's trajectory, and she was prepared for anything that lay ahead. Uncertainty and stress pervaded the weeks that followed. The company's financial department was skeptical of Margaret's appointment. A few high-ranking officials laughed it off, unable to see the potential in a woman who had previously worked as a cleaner. Everyone waited silently to see whether she would be unsuccessful. Still, Margaret showed no signs of fear. Gaining their trust wouldn't be an overnight process, she understood. She dug in, examining the financial data, finding holes, and offering remedies nobody had thought of before. Despite his first reservations, Thomas soon came to terms with the fact that he had made the correct choice. Margaret possessed unmatched analytical prowess and meticulous attention to detail. She found long-lost inefficiencies and suggested fixes that sped up the company's recovery more than anyone had expected. The distrust gradually subsided. Her former detractors in the executive ranks now seek her counsel. Workers who had previously disregarded her began to pay her attention, and Thomas finally felt like his company was back on solid ground, which had been a long time coming. After a few months, the business not only leveled out but started to grow again. Thanks to Margaret's advice, we were able to reorganize several critical sectors, resulting in significant savings and a redefinition of our investment priorities. The poisonous culture that had enabled corruption to thrive began to crumble under her leadership, and transparency became paramount. Her rise through the ranks from housekeeper to critical financial analyst served as an example to her colleagues. Workers at all levels started to look up to her as evidence that hard work and skill were more important than rank. As a result of all he went through, Thomas became much more modest and composed. A lesson he had to learn the hard way was that leadership was about more than just having authority. It also meant appreciating and acknowledging the employees who were responsible for the company's execution. Margaret overheard a group of lower-level employees chatting one night as she strolled through the workplace. Their mockery of her had subsided. On the contrary, they were gushing over her. An individual mentioned that she was the first to notice the issues. Maybe we wouldn't be where we are today if she hadn't come along. Margaret skipped over their presence. On the contrary, she just grinned and continued on her way. She was self-assured. What she had intended to do had been accomplished. She had shown that the most unrecognized individuals can often be the most influential. And it wasn't all. With this transition, the organization entered a new age, one in which honesty and responsibility were paramount. Margaret, meantime, was prepared to take the lead. However, you have chosen to ignore the individuals who played a crucial role in shaping it. Because of that, things became awful. It was your inability to look past your personal achievements that brought us to this point. Thomas fixed Margaret with a fixed gaze, his mouth clenched. You really believe you can solve the problem, huh? I'm not requesting to replace you, Margaret responded with composure. A position as Chief Executive Officer is not necessary for me. However, if I make my situation public, the board will take my advice. This company was about to collapse before I intervened. Please do what's right and stand down so that another leader can restore faith in the future of this organization. They fell into a long period of quiet. His thoughts were racing. He was the one in charge, the one who made the difficult decisions. From the beginning, he felt like he wasn't really in control of the decision-making process now. He felt doomed at the prospect of leaving the firm he had founded and grown from the ground up. However, the truth could not be ignored. Margaret had a point. The controversy would ruin everything if he declined. He would face ouster from the board, relentless coverage from the media, and a precipitous decline in the company's stock price. Margaret knew that the evidence she had was enough to destroy him. Under the crushing pressure of his own shortcomings, he sensed the walls around him. He didn't miss the irony. Even though he had shied away from her for years, the strong CEO found himself helplessly entangled with the lady who had listened in on boardroom discussions while cleaning the floors, uncovered the secrets of the company's financial collapse, and prevented its demise. Now it was her turn to issue the impossible ultimatum. Finally, Thomas broke the silence with a heavy groan. What will occur after my resignation? A little pleading in Margaret's eyes betrayed no change in her determination. We will see the firm through. The board will select a new chief executive officer, CEO, someone who appreciates the significance of the whole, not only the bottom line. To make sure everything goes well, I'll remain on. Truthful transformation, however, must be communicated to the board. With his mind spinning, Thomas gazed at her. His kingdom, which he had laboriously built over many years, vanished in an instant. Margaret was correct. He knew it in his heart. He had lost his tenure as CEO. The moment had come for fresh leadership, someone who could restore the company's standing from the bottom up after his haughtiness had clouded his judgment. "All right," he murmured softly, his voice nearly caught in his throat. "I will resign. You didn't force me to do it, though. I am acting in the interest of the business." Margaret, seeing his need to maintain some dignity at this moment, nodded slightly. No one could have asked for more. Thomas got to his feet and made his way to the window, where he gazed at the cityscape below. Once a source of strength and command, the view now seemed far away, as if it belonged to another universe entirely. He was the public face of the firm and its driving force for many years. Finally, it was the unassuming cleaning lady who had prevented its collapse. Thomas spoke a final time, his voice barely audible, as Margaret turned to depart. "Am I completely oblivious to this?" Margaret stood at the door, her palm on the handle. "You weren't looking," she stated plainly. Leaving Thomas to ponder his solitude, she departed from the room. The following day, word of Thomas Reed's departure quickly circulated throughout the organization. A new age was dawning, and while some were surprised, others were relieved. The board and top executives were the only ones who knew Margaret's true involvement in rescuing the company from certain doom, but the rest of us were in the dark. Margaret remained behind, prepared to assist in guiding the company into its next chapter, as Thomas stealthily left the building he had formerly controlled. Despite not having the official title of CEO, the long-ignored cleaning lady had become the company's most powerful figure. Although Margaret was unprepared for the difficulties she would face in her new position within the company's finance department, she eagerly embraced them. She became an integral part of the company's comeback thanks to her thorough understanding of finances and meticulous attention to detail. Realizing that their prior hubris had almost brought the company to its knees, the executives who had previously ignored her now sought her advice. Margaret oversaw the implementation of new policies that increased openness and responsibility inside the organization. A voice was given to the employees, and they were no longer disregarded. Individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds were given the tools they needed to advance in the organization through the implementation of a mentorship program. Margaret resolved to make it her life's work to prevent anyone from ever being ignored as she had been. Months after that, Margaret overheard a discussion among lower-level staff members as she strolled through the workplace. Their mockery of her had subsided. On the contrary, they spoke highly of her. An individual mentioned that she was the first to notice the issues. Maybe we wouldn't be where we are today if she hadn't come along. Margaret skipped over their presence. With a simple smile, she continued walking. She was self-assured. What she had intended to do had been accomplished. She demonstrated that often the most unrecognized individuals are the ones who may exert the most influence. And it wasn't all. With this transition, the organization entered a new age, one in which honesty and responsibility were paramount. Margaret, meantime, was prepared to take the lead. The turnaround at the business was moving quite nicely. Realizing that their prior hubris had almost brought the company to its knees, the executives who had previously ignored her now sought her advice. Margaret was doing more than just showing up in the finance department. She was actually making a difference by enacting procedures that encouraged honesty and openness. To avoid similar financial mishandling in the future, she oversaw the replacement of antiquated and ineffective systems with more efficient ones. Margaret collaborated closely with the board to reorganize leadership, bringing those responsible for previous wrongdoing to justice, and creating a climate where trust and ethical decision-making could flourish. Corrupt practices were eradicated. Instead of meddling in politics, her mission here was to restore order. Some employees remained averse to change despite the advancements. Margaret was seen by several executives as an outsider who had somehow manipulated her way into authority, and this perception led them to resent her increasing influence. In a low voice, they cast doubt on her experience and skills, referring to her just as the former housekeeper. However, Margaret completely ignored them. She was determined not to allow their skepticism undermine her self-assurance, especially after years of being disregarded. Her dedication to her work was evident. She put in a lot of time, reading through financial reports and going to meetings where she wasn't welcome before. She served as a liaison between management and personnel, ensuring that voices were heard at all levels. Margaret had experienced the pain of being disregarded more than anybody else, and she was hell-bent on preventing anyone else from going through the same thing at work. Even more ambitious than reorganizing the company's finances, Margaret set out to alter the company's ethos. To foster a new crop of honest business leaders who would prioritize honesty over authority, she advocated for leadership development programs. She created mentorship programs to help employees from low-income backgrounds, which opened doors for them that she herself had never had. People took note of the company's change. Assuaged by the massive changes happening, investors who had thought about withdrawing their money started putting it back in. A gradual recovery was observed in the stock price, which had fallen precipitously following the incident. Workers who were worried about losing their employment were able to rest easy after new management took over. Margaret was the driving force behind the company's rehabilitation process. A few months down the road, Margaret strolled through the workplace and overheard co-workers gushing about her, not in a condescending or disparaging way, but with genuine respect and admiration. An co-worker remarked, "She saved us. This place would have collapsed if she hadn't been here." Someone else gave a confirming nod. And here we were, mindlessly strolling past her before. Margaret skipped over their presence. Just grinning to herself, she continued on her way. Acknowledgement was never her goal. For her, it was all about the work she was doing and the difference it was making. Margaret received an email from Thomas Reed one day as she was going over company reports in her new office. Even though it was short, the point was made. "I see things differently now, thank you." After a lengthy period of staring, Margaret finally closed the email. Thomas was no longer able to ignore her after years of doing so. Actions, not labels, were what mattered, as she had demonstrated. After going unrecognized as a cleaning lady, Margaret became the unsung hero who rescued a whole business. She was well aware that her trip was far from finished as she got ready for yet another grueling day on the job. She was only at the beginning of what lay ahead. Margaret's leadership during the company's revival was just outstanding. The same executives who were too proud to admit she was valuable suddenly sought her advice and counsel, realizing she had a keen financial intellect and could make good decisions. A once impossible scenario, a former cleaner spearheading the company's comeback, was now becoming a reality. Margaret was adamant about establishing an accountability and transparency-based work culture as the reorganization progressed. She was determined to make long-term reforms, since she understood that the company's past problems had originated from dishonest leadership. She convened seminars for workers at all levels, stressing the value of honesty, transparency, and responsible leadership. The employees were able to express their worries, offer suggestions, and take an active role in determining the company's future during these sessions, which marked a turning point. The executives who had previously ignored Margaret were now sitting in her seminars, paying close attention as she laid out a fresh strategy. Arrogance was a factor in the poisonous culture that almost doomed the organization, and many of them came to terms with it. On the other hand, Margaret was more concerned with finding answers than assigning blame. No one else in the firm, no matter their position, should ever feel ignored like she had. That was her goal. In pursuit of this objective, Margaret established a mentorship program to assist employees hailing from disadvantaged backgrounds. Being evaluated only based on one's position, rather than one's abilities, was something she knew all too well. By sharing her story and inspiring younger employees to follow their dreams despite setbacks, she served as a mentor through this program. Rebuilding the company wasn't her only goal. She also wanted to create an inclusive environment where everyone could achieve their dreams. The company's prosperity was directly proportional to Margaret's rising profile. Customer trust was restored, staff morale skyrocketed, and sales picked up steam again. Assuaged by the seismic shifts occurring, investors who had contemplated selling their shares have suddenly increased their backing. Despite their early skepticism, Margaret's unorthodox ascension won over the board of directors, who eventually became her staunchest advocates. Her leadership vision was evident to them, and she was more than simply a financial specialist. Even outside of the office, Margaret was well respected. She was a sought-after speaker at conferences in her field, where she addressed topics including diversity, ethical leadership, and resilience. Many found inspiration in her narrative, which she shared with other professionals who had experienced job stagnation. Standing before audiences of future leaders, she frequently thought about how far she had gone, from being a silent protester in the corridors to a powerful advocate for change in the corporate sphere. Margaret maintained her modesty despite her great accomplishment. The years she spent mopping floors, the times executives made fun of her, and the innumerable times they ignored her were all things she would never forget. She made the decision to be grateful rather than bitter. She felt grateful for the chance to have a positive impact, for the respect she had acquired from her co-workers, and for the life lessons she had gained. Her hard work was appreciated. The company's metamorphosis into an exemplar of responsible corporate citizenship and ethical business practices earned it a slew of awards. The media also covered Margaret's remarkable rise to prominence, which helped establish her as a pioneer in the field. She was grateful for the attention, but she stayed committed to using her platform for a greater purpose, while the interviews came rolling in. For marginalized groups in business, Margaret became a ferocious ally. Her speech emphasized the significance of providing underrepresented groups with opportunities and the necessity for diverse leadership. Success, in her view, was more about the difference one made in the lives of others than it was about material possessions or social status. The once struggling organization became a symbol of hope and perseverance under Margaret's leadership. It transformed into a renowned organization recognized for its dedication to moral business practices, welfare of employees, and involvement in the community. It had evolved into something more than a place of employment, a haven for those who worked there. Margaret kept in mind her humble beginnings, despite all the praise and admiration she received. She put an emphasis on building relationships with her staff by hearing their experiences and motivating them to achieve their dreams. From the janitors on up to the CEOs, she thought everyone was important to the company's success. The goal of her leadership was always to bring people together and encourage them to work together, not to cling to power. Personal life for Margaret also thrived alongside her career. She got back in touch with her family and spent time with her grown children, who were inspired by her resilience and strength as they saw her overcome challenges. Their admiration extended beyond her professional accomplishments to the resilience and fortitude that had seen her through life's darkest hours. They frequently shared introspective thoughts about the struggles they had conquered and the triumphs they had achieved as a unit. The corporate world wasn't the only place Margaret wanted to make an impact. She started lending a hand to local groups as a volunteer, guiding people through tough financial times with her knowledge and experience. She realized the value of redistributing resources so that others could benefit from the same possibilities she had toiled for. What began as a story of her own personal triumph has evolved into a powerful testament to the power of perseverance, empowerment, and optimism. When Margaret dared to question the established quo and had faith in herself, she demonstrated that significant change was achievable. Margaret never wavered in her pursuit of fairness, equality, and ethical leadership, even as the business flourished. From her humble beginnings as an unsung cleaner to her current position as a revered leader, she had shown many people that they, too, could overcome obstacles. One thing was clear to Margaret as she stood in her office and looked out at the firm she had helped rebuild. Her journey was only just starting. For being a part of this amazing journey, we are eternally grateful. Give it a thumbs up, spread the word, and subscribe for more incredible stories if you enjoyed it. We are incredibly grateful for your support. Thank you for tuning in.